You don't have to let go of all those beliefs in the state that have been ingrained into them.
And you know what the toughest thing for me was when you believe in the government to whatever tiny degree, you get to step around a whole lot of problems when it comes to explaining how society works, because you still got courts, police, military, you self-defense, the defense of the realm or whatever, right? You still have that all sorted out, right?
Yes.
And then you go with the objectivist problem like voluntary taxation but no competition. Like, it just gets all quagmire, right? But what it does is it allows you to bring people a long way without having to address things like, well, how do you deal with murderers? And how do you deal with roads? And how do you deal with national defense, right? And so the amount of creativity that it takes, or creative and intellectual energy, research, thinking, reading, debating, that it takes for that last 2% that was huge. It was much more effort for me to go that last 2% than it was to go the first 98%.
I agree. When I was reading The Market for Liberty for the first time, that was kind of my transition period. And when I was reading the parts of that book about how justice could work in a free market system, it was very difficult for me to.
That's your Scanners moment, right?
Yeah, like, wow. I knew I had to go back through and read it over again, because it just wasn't, one time wasn't enough for me to really process it. And even after the second time of reading just that chapter or the couple chapters over again, it still took me quite a while to really bust through that barrier.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like saying we should treat slaves better and there should be fewer of them. Is not as big a leap as, you know what, the whole thing is just bad, and it's evil to have them, right? So that was killer for me. And it happened actually for me just in a debate I was having with someone where I was taking a standard objectivist position, and they brought up pollution and things like that, and I came up with a solution that's in podcasts, so I won't go into it here, but and then it was like, literally, it was like I took 3 steps back, like I had a holy roller moment, like I was waiting for like the thunderbolt of libertarianism to come straight through the roof, and like I had to sit down, because it was one of those moments where it's just like, it all just started to unfold from there. But what I had to do was to let go of holding on to that which had enough answers for me to get by, but not enough for me to really grow as a thinker, because those, almost answers are really terrible because they stop you right at that edge, whereas just saying, I'm going to jump and hope, right, and that worked out much better. But it was really, really tough transition for me.
How does voluntary society work? And it boils down to, and I think it has to be left at this: you don't kill people to provide services. How they are actually provided are on a voluntary basis. How each individual one, you have to think about that. And it's that thought process of how that would actually function. It gives people so much of a difficult, to get to that, because they don't want to actually think. You tell me, Ian or Stefan, you tell me in your podcast exactly how you deal with child rapists. And if you can't explain that, I'm not going to accept it.
Right. But see, this is the trap. I know you probably get this a lot. I get this a lot. This is the trap, and it's actually it's a very subtle status trap, because if one person, let's say you or me or anyone, one person was smart enough to figure out how a whole free society would work, that would actually be an argument for a dictator, right? Because you'd be smart enough to reproduce every decision that everyone could possibly make, and I know how all resolutions should be, but you can't. There is no conceivable way. What you do know is that free people find solutions.
Yes.
Right? There's no economics person who can say, here's where all the goods and materials should be produced, and we should have this many baby carriages and this many railway cars and so on. It's impossible, but you know that in a free society, the allocation of resources will be very efficient. In the same way, I don't know how child rapists are going to be dealt with in a free society, but I do know that a stateless society will produce far fewer of them for a variety of philosophical and psychological reasons, and that people will not want there to be child rapists in society, and that people have this capacity called economic exclusion, which is incredibly powerful and is how things used to work in the past. But how, what exact contracts are going to be signed and how it's all going to work, it's impossible. And if I could do that, that would be an argument for the government, because then someone would be smart enough to organize everything, which
a great leader
would be crazy, right? I mean, then some genius Stalin can just phone everyone in the morning and say, here's what you're doing with your day, I sent you a list, right? And it's not possible. But we do know that violence, as you say, is the worst conceivable way to solve any problem except direct violence, right? The future, the society without a state, has no precedent that we can find. That you can talk about Iceland or Ireland, but people don't care and people don't know, right? Yeah, and you can talk about Somalia, but these are examples of society collapsing into anarchy. That's not the same as through violence, right? It's like saying
in Somalia they've got the situation where the UN is trying to force new governments on top
pumping weapons in. They're selling weapons in there. The U.S. is funding rebels and violence, and so I mean that's like saying, well, a building collapsed, and therefore I blew up a building, therefore I'm an engineer, right? I mean that just so you. When you're looking to the 95% reduction in the state, you're going back in time to a precedent that is pretty well recognized and accepted. Like people
We're
say, well,
evolving,
the
so.
Republic, the founding fathers, the minimal state, and so on. So people say, well, we want to go back, right? And that's what people say, we want to go back to that. And so people have a place that they can start from that is recognizable. Say, let's go back to the good old days, right? But when you talk about a stateless society, you're like, it's like the end of 2001. People see this giant baby head approaching the planet, like some new future that nobody can really get. And that, I think, is the really tough part.
Liberty, free market, voluntarist, consensualist ideas. We have to bring enough people on board to where it becomes a popular movement. I mean, right now we're just a bunch of crazies in a hotel in Nashua. I mean, the amount of people is growing, and that's good. And that's really, I think, all that it's going to take. Once we get enough people together, then it'll become something where there's a voluntarist in every place of business, and there's a voluntarist in everywhere that people are experiencing their lives, and there's voluntarist television and radio and newsprint. I mean, I say those things, and we have them actually in Keene. I mean, we've got my show originating from there. Free Minds TV and Free Minds Radio comes out of Keene. The New Hampshire Free Press is there. So we already have TV, radio, and newsprint. So it's just a matter of backing those ideas up with the people that are on the ground who can say, yeah, I agree with that. And then the reality is most people are followers, right? They're not the thinkers that we would want them to be. So we have to find the thinkers, get them to come on board with us, and then everybody else is just going to climb on board because it'll seem like a foregone conclusion eventually. Like, oh yeah, why didn't we think of that? So
Right.
We're getting there, but it's going to take. That's why the Free State Project is such a great idea, to converge all of these activists in the one place. I mean, you called them intense earlier.
Yeah.
You really have to be an intense activist to uproot your life and move somewhere that you don't know anybody. Well, you don't know them at first, but as you've seen, everybody here gets along really well with one another right off the bat. So even though you don't know anybody necessarily, when you get here, there are a whole bunch of people that are willing to be your friend and willing to get to know you, and that's just, this level of camaraderie and synergy is something that the Liberty Movement has, I don't believe, ever experienced, and it's coming, right? I mean, we can see the voluntary society. We don't know exactly how it's going to work, but we know the fundamentals, and we can see it happening in the future. So it's just a matter of, and I guess that's what we're talking about here, is how we get from here to there. I think it's people.
Yeah, just about ideas. I've said for a long time, it's not about George Bush or the Bush dynasty, whatever. It's about the ideas that are in people's heads that allow them to do what they're doing. We don't need to talk about the Masons, because if you didn't have this mindset that people seem, or at least act on, if that wasn't there, that government is nothing more, is somehow more than just a gang of killers, thieves, and liars. If that wasn't there, no amount of Masons could do what's being done, or Illuminati.
They're free riding on the illusions of
Yeah,
people,
right. They rely on those illusions, and as long as those illusions, so that's why the education is so important. And I just wanted to bring them real quick. I'm very surprised that there was someone at the talk today that I gave that started crying.
Wow.
And it was right at the point, and I had mentioned that a lot of times people have been thrown into a kind of a depression that I've worked with, and notwithstanding that the IRS isn't bothering anymore, which should lift a huge burden, you'd think. But it was the part where someone had said to me, "You tore my reality out and didn't replace it with anything." And I'm really sorry. There's really not much. I mean, the things are still, Ian's still Ian. This is still the table. The difference is, that who you are is not based on political public relations. It has nothing to do with some slogan from a politician. Not that you being a citizen or an American doesn't define who you are, but initially that can be very, well, in this case,
and if you
distressing.
if you filter up with something, that would be against what you want to do, which is to have people think for themselves, right? Like, you don't want to rip out mythology and replace it with ideology, right? Which is sometimes the objectivist thing, not to slam objectivism, which I'm a huge fan of, but you want to teach people to think, right? Like, people come up to me and say, because I just had a kid, right? They say, well, are you going to teach her about Santa Claus? And of course, the point is to not teach children conclusions, teach people conclusions, but teach them how to think, right? And not fall into
questions.
Yeah, ask questions. Say, okay, well, so you've heard this story called Santa Claus. Let's think about it. What do you think? How would we know? So that she can reason it out for herself. That way she can never come back to me and say, you told me that was right. But so she can think for herself. And that's really what we want people to do. And when you take away the easy, empty, non-answers that people get in the guise of wisdom and knowledge, then yeah, they feel this I'm a vacuum, I got nothing, right? But out of that grows a real personality, like a real human being who can think and feel and express.
You're no longer an automaton.
Yeah.
You're no longer
You're out of the
following
matrix.
the script that they've laid out for you. Whether it was organized religion or the government that said, okay, well, here's what you need to believe and here's what you need to do. You need to go to college, you need to get yourself a career, you need to retire.
Yeah.
And this is kind of the path that everybody believes that they're on until they come across this information, and then you rip that out of them. That's what probably that lady was experiencing, or I'm not sure, lady, guy, the lady was experiencing was, her paradigm was being destroyed inside herself, and that's not an easy thing to come to grips with. But I like that you say that you can plant something there and really have it flower out, and I think that's absolutely the case.